Thank you, Madam President. I rise in opposition to this resolution in the strongest terms possible as a piece of war propaganda that I will not have my name or my vote attached to. This resolution on the war in Ukraine is riddled with half-truths, historical omissions, and dangerous conclusions that urge our nation down the path towards a potential global nuclear war, the likes of which no one alive or dead on this earth has ever seen, and one that humanity will never experience twice. Rather than urging peace talks to bring an end to this dangerous border dispute halfway across the world, this resolution presents a simplistic narrative with no grounding in the realities of foreign policy or the history of Eastern Europe since the end of the Cold War, in order to justify a continued blank check, now over $100 billion, much of it totally unaccounted for, from the pockets of U.S. taxpayers to the Ukrainian government in an undeclared proxy war with no exit strategy and in which continued escalation endangers the entire world. Passing this resolution, adding the voice of the main Senate to this fool's errand, would be grossly irresponsible. I will readily admit that when I was a young man, I was fooled once by war propaganda. But to quote the president who fooled me, "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, you aren't going to fool me twice." After learning the lessons of the disastrous Middle East wars, I resolved to follow the advice of another president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who served as Supreme Commander of the Allied forces during World War II. In his farewell address to Congress, he told America to beware the military-industrial complex. It is also worth remembering the words of Major General Smedley Butler, a very decorated Marine and veteran of World War I, who simply put it, war is a racket. So whenever the bipartisan war machine, the uniparty in Washington, urges our country into foreign wars, it is the responsibility of all citizens, especially lawmakers and bodies like these, to maintain cool heads and ask basic questions. So let's begin with a basic question about one of the claims in this resolution, seemingly parroting a repeated line in the corporate press, which is funded with advertising dollars from weapons manufacturers, that the Russian invasion in Ukraine was unprovoked. Madam President, there are many justifiable adjectives to describe this war: bloody, vicious, murderous, tyrannical, evil, illegal. I would accept any of these, but I will not sign my name to a lie. The claim this invasion was unprovoked can only be uttered sincerely if history began the day Russian troops crossed the border. In truth, there's been a long line of provocations, many made by Washington officials supposedly accountable to the American people, bringing us to this crisis point. To be clear, provocation does not justify an action. A man may violently stab another who shoved him first. That stabbing would be wrong, just as this invasion is wrong. But it would also be false to say it was unprovoked. This word is used to absolve Washington war hawks of the numerous acts of incompetence and malevolence in the decades of buildup to this conflict since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And if we do not acknowledge the actions of our own foreign policy elites in our own federal government that have contributed to this war, then we have no hope in prescribing a proper course of action to bring about a peaceful resolution. Throughout the Cold War, the number one American foreign policy goal with regards to the Soviet Union was to keep nuclear weapons at bay. When the Cold War ended and the Soviet government dissolved, the nuclear arsenals remained, and so did the American interest in avoiding conflict that could bring about the end of the world as we know it. That's why there were agreements in those early days of the new era that Russia would not contest the reunification of Germany and its admittance into NATO. In exchange, American officials committed in writing that NATO would not extend, quote, 1 inch east beyond the German border. That agreement was promptly violated in the 1990s under President Clinton against the explicit warnings of American foreign policy experts who cautioned Russia would fear and react to these violations as nakedly hostile attempts to surround them militarily. And every American president since, Republicans and Democrats both, this is a bipartisan problem, has continued this manifest destiny policy of eastward NATO expansion towards the Russian border, disregarding the consistent warnings from both U.S. foreign policy realists and repeated red lines from the Russians that this is viewed as an existential threat to their national security. Some say NATO is a defensive alliance, so what does Russia have to worry about? I would ask them to tell that to Muammar Gaddafi, the former leader of Libya. His government invaded no other nation, and yet his life ended as he was sodomized to death in the streets after a NATO-led regime change war in his country. Is that what a defensive military alliance does? And for what purpose? Certainly no humanitarian outcome. The people of Libya now find themselves subject to open-air slave markets today in the 21st century.
They sell Africans over there, in Libya. They sell men. Even 15-year-old Libyans are there in a car, they're armed. They'll come and kidnap you, and they'll sell you for $70 to $150.
But these migrants will tell you that life is so hard in their home country that it's worth almost any risk to make a new start in Europe.
There is no excuse for invading a sovereign country. This is the principle readily proclaimed in this present foreign crisis, and one with which I heartily agree. But it is odd to hear this principle now often repeated in Washington by the very war hawks who I've watched since I was 12 years old.
My question of you is, those people that have not supported the effort and raised questions about the president and his diplomacy efforts, said that 1441 wasn't enough, we needed to give him more time, will they be embarrassed when we find all these weapons of mass destruction?
Lying the American people into wars with invented pretexts to justify the invasion and occupation of sovereign Middle East countries for decades on end, paid for with the blood of our soldiers and the treasure of our taxpayers.
It is obvious that American business can become the locomotive that will once again push forward global economic growth. We have already managed to attract attention and have cooperation with such giants of the international financial and investment world as BlackRock, JP Morgan, and Goldman Sachs. Such American brands as Starlink or Westinghouse have already become part of our Ukrainian way. Your brilliant defense systems, such as HIMARS or Bradleys, are already uniting our history of freedom with your enterprises. We are waiting for Patriots. We are looking closely at Abrams. Thousands of such examples are possible, and everyone can become a big business by working with Ukraine in all sectors, from weapons and defense to construction, from communication to agriculture, from transport to IT, from banks to medicine. And I believe that freedom must always win.
If the freedom to dream were a spear, I proudly present a human being who tonight represents that spear's most honed tip.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants of the 80th Golden Globe Award ceremony.
And I wonder, Madam President, how we would feel as Americans if our roles were reversed. For a moment, I would ask this chamber to imagine a mirror reality, one in which the Russians won the Cold War and the Warsaw Pact was inducting Canada into its membership, putting their military on our border just north of Aroostook County. Would we shrug our shoulders and rest assured that the Warsaw Pact is only a defensive military alliance? Would we tell ourselves there was nothing to worry about after watching the Soviet Union, as the world's last empire and superpower left standing, spend the last 2 decades on regime change wars across the Middle East with death tolls nearing 1 million? As their military alliance snaked its way through Central America toward our southern border, with the KGB running intelligence operations to manipulate election outcomes and overthrow uncooperative leaders, would we not demand our leaders do something to protect our country from the threat encircling us? And if our economy and our military were a shadow of their former glory, and all we had left was a nuclear arsenal to tell Russia not to mess with us, how far would America be pushed before twitchy fingers were on the button? In truth, we don't have to imagine too hard how our country would respond to a Russian military threat on our border, because we know how America did respond during the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy considered Russian missiles off our coast a provocation, and he took action to secure our country, just as any national leader responsible to their people would when an antagonistic military force is approaching their border. Only fools would put a country with a nuclear arsenal in that position.
My freedom is being kind of disturbed here. No, screw your freedom.
Cornered, fearful, and desperate, and then reject all offers to negotiate. Thankfully, Kennedy used diplomacy to defuse the danger of that situation, a skill our leaders in Washington today seem unwilling or unable to exercise. Both Presidents Kennedy and Reagan, adamant Cold Warriors both, none would be accused of being friends to the Russians, always maintained open communication with the leaders of Russia to avoid escalation into nuclear conflict. Instead, our present-day leaders refused diplomacy and pushed the war forward to the last Ukrainian standing, not for the benefit of the people of Ukraine, but to bleed the Russians dry, as in Afghanistan throughout the 1980s. This posture isn't for the Ukrainian people. This isn't for the American people. This is for the empire that now stands in the place of our once proud republic on a mountain of corpses to maintain global hegemony. That's why in 2014, then Vice President Joe Biden oversaw the overthrow of the democratically elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. His crime was not signing a trade deal with the European Union. In actuality, he wanted to sign 2 trade deals with both Russia and the West. But when the EU agreement suddenly prohibited any economic agreement with Russia, Yanukovych says he felt like a bride who showed up for a wedding only to discover a never-before-discussed prenuptial agreement, and he just wasn't in the mood anymore. For that, he was regime changed. And if you doubt Washington, D.C. had anything to do with it, I have a bridge to sell you in Libya. Thanks to leaked phone calls, we know for a fact that the current Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland, personally handpicked the leaders of the new government to replace Yanukovych. You can hear the phone call in her own voice as she speaks with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine about who is in and who is out in the new Ukrainian regime to make the whole thing stick.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, the EU.
With Victoria Nuland's audio being heard by everybody, it was impossible for the U.S. government to deny that it played this active role. And watch Jen Psaki try and nonetheless deny it.
Officials talk about issues around the world. Of course we do. That's what you do. That's what diplomats do, and discuss especially issues where we've been closely engaged. The secretary met with the opposition this weekend. He stopped by a meeting with the foreign minister. It's up to the people of Ukraine, including officials from both sides, to determine the path forward. But it shouldn't be a surprise that there are discussions about events on the ground.
This was more than discussions, though. This was 2 top U.S. officials that are on the ground discussing a plan that they have to broker a future government and bringing officials from the UN to kind of seal the deal. This is more than the U.S. trying to make suggestions. This is the U.S. midwifing the process.
Well,
isn't it amazing when you see actual journalism at work?
That shouldn't be a surprise. Of course these things are being discussed.
I don't think that it is honest for you to say, no, we don't have an opinion, and that's completely up to the people of country
Matt,
X.
there's a
and I specifically mean, in this case, I'm talking about Egypt.
Sure. Well, let me
because
just,
you
just
do have an
make
opinion.
one comment here. There is a difference between private discussions that happen in the interagency process, in the building, and what we convey publicly as a U.S. government. Of course, you're discussing a range of options on a range of issues.
But if you,
that's what you do as
I'm sorry,
a diplomat.
If you're saying privately, behind the scenes, that you're cooking up a deal, and then you're saying publicly that this is up for Ukrainians to decide, those are 2 totally different things. I understand that diplomatic discussions are sensitive and you don't want everything to come out, but those are 2 totally different positions.
Elise, what do you think happens behind closed doors when people are discussing issues internally through the interagency?
This is not discussing issues. This is talking about a deal that the U.S. was cooking up.
I think I would disagree with you. I think you're overstating and over-qualifying a couple of minutes from a privately recorded phone call.
The fact that the U.S. government toppled the democratically elected leader of Ukraine in 2013 and 2014 and replaced him with the U.S. stooge chosen by Victoria Nuland is something that a few months ago, if you said it, you were told you were a Kremlin propagandist or a conspiracy theorist. But if you actually go look at the record at the time, it was a known fact. It was something that was constantly discussed and acknowledged, even by the press corps, the mainstream press corps that covers the State Department. Just like for 10 years, it was commonplace for Western media to acknowledge and report that the dominant militia in Ukraine was a neo-Nazi militia called the Azov Battalion, and now that too is something that cannot be said since we are now arming and funding that neo-Nazi militia in the name of stopping fascism. But that is the purpose of journalism, is to take government propaganda, analyze it and scrutinize it and dissect it and show the truth with evidence.
I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
In terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, you know, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Cleach and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, you know. I just think Cleach going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work. I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Cleach and Tony Book on the outside. I just think Cleach going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay. Good. Well, do you want us to try to set up a call with him as the next step?
Sullivan's come back to me VFR saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
So you had this remarkable phone call where you have these 2 senior officials of the U.S. government apparently talking about a coup or how they were planning to restructure the government of Ukraine.
Fuck the EU.
No, exactly.
I'm not saying the whole U.S. government feels that way. There is division on this, but the neoconservative element wants very much to change the strategic dynamic in Eastern Europe.
Is this what democracy looks like? I don't think so. And after the coup, the new government, urged on by local neo-Nazi groups like the Azov Battalion, and when I say neo-Nazi groups, I don't mean in the parlance that's often thrown around today. I mean actual Adolf Hitler-loving neo-Nazis who welcomed the German invasion during World War II.
There is a suggestion for Nuland to contact Klitschko directly to play to his top dog sensibilities, while Nuland refers to getting the United Nations involved in a political solution. And that's where the unfortunate comment arises.
I'm obviously not going to comment on private diplomatic conversations, other than to say it was pretty impressive tradecraft. The audio was extremely clear. Hello, how are you? Good to see you. We're here from America. Would you like some bread? Please take something.
Thank you for coming.
This was Nuland and Pyatt visiting Independence Square in Kiev in December, handing out food to protesters and police. This latest episode is embarrassing for the US and allows Russia to argue that the opposition is being manipulated by Washington, something that Barack Obama has always denied.
They urged the government and succeeded in banning the speaking of Russian and launching an ethnic cleansing campaign in the eastern regions of Ukraine. Russia responded, yes, by annexing the Crimean Peninsula to maintain control of the Sevastopol naval base, Russia's only warm water port with access to the Black Sea, which is a sort of Russian Alamo after many died defending it against German invasion in World War II. Whatever we think of that, it is of such strategic and nationalistic importance to the Russians. We better be prepared for nuclear war if we want them to give that up, because they're not going to give that up. But at the same time, he rejected petitions from ethnically Russian people in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, now at the center of the war, who wanted to secede and join Russia. But over the next 8 years, a civil war raged in these separatist regions. Our own government funneled weapons into the conflict. In 2016, I represented Maine on the National Platform Committee of my political party, along with our colleague, Senator Guerin of Penobscot County. At the time, I was shocked to read calls for sending these weapons into this civil war halfway across the world. That's why I opposed that language and fought to strike it from the document, warning that these policies could escalate into a nuclear conflict. And 7 years later, here we are, living under the shadow of it all.
And by the way, most of that $110 billion total between the 45, the 1.7, and the previous 65, over 110 billion, is spent here in the United States. It's provided to contractors and defense logisticians and the kinds of people who build the kinds of systems that we're getting. So most of that money is spent here in America. Good, hardworking Americans have the jobs. And when you look at that kind of an investment, what would be the difference if, when the giant does awake, and that's all about communist China, it's just not a plug for this book. The idea of it is to make sure that they get the right message, and to make sure that Putin gets the right message. No more invasions. And that means the people in Taiwan are going to need the same kinds of weapon systems that we're now providing to the Ukrainians. And we better get hot at it, because the communist Chinese aren't backing down, but they're watching very carefully what we're doing. And so, Jason, in my humble opinion, this is money well spent. And it's expensive stuff. The Patriot batteries themselves are very expensive. When you look at each one of the Patriot PAC-3 missiles, literally, comes in well over $1 billion a battery and $1 million a missile. So you're trying to shoot at stuff that's being flown by Putin as he's trying to redraw the boundaries of Europe. A Patriot battery, 1.5 billion. Each Patriot missile, 4 million. The max range about 100 miles. So the Iranians Shahed drones, 80-pound warhead, 25K apiece. That's what we're up against. And he's got volleys and volleys of them that they're firing at infrastructure in the dead of winter.
Colonel, the concern is that Vladimir Putin turns this suddenly into World War III. You're familiar with Putin. Does this provoke him in such a way that it gives him a justification to escalate war and take it outside the bounds of Ukraine?
Look, he's been rattling the nuclear saber since all of this, before all this began on the 24th of February. And Putin does this routinely. And in my humble opinion, I don't think Vladimir Putin could fire a nuclear weapon anywhere in Europe. I think there have been so many mutinies in his armed forces.
It is obvious that American business can become the locomotive that will once again push forward global economic growth. We have already managed to attract attention and have cooperation with such giants of the international financial and investment world as BlackRock, JP Morgan, and Goldman Sachs. Such American brands as Starlink or Westinghouse have already become part of our Ukrainian way.
Because we believe this narrative was intended to deceive the family, but more importantly, to deceive the American public. Pat's death was clearly the result of fratricide. Revealing that Pat's death was a fratricide would have been yet another political disaster during a month already swollen with political disasters, and the brutal truth that the American public would undoubtedly find unacceptable. So the facts needed to be suppressed. An alternative narrative had to be constructed. Crucial evidence was destroyed, including Pat's uniform, equipment, and notebook. The autopsy was not done in accordance to regulation, and the field hospital report was falsified. An initial investigation completed with 8 to 10 days before testimony could be changed or manipulated, and which hit disturbingly close to the mark, disappeared into thin air, and was conveniently replaced by another investigation with more palatable findings. This freshly manufactured narrative was then distributed to the American public, and we believe the strategy had the intended effect. It shifted the focus from the grotesque torture at Abu Ghraib and a downward spiral of an illegal act of aggression to a great American who died a hero's death.
This war will go as long as it takes to get the job done.
Your brilliant defense systems such as HIMARS or Bradleys, are already uniting our history of freedom with your enterprises. We are waiting for Patriots. We are looking closely at Abrams. Thousands of such examples are possible, and everyone can become a big business by working with Ukraine in all sectors, from weapons and defense to construction, from communication to agriculture, from transport to IT, from banks to medicine. And I believe that freedom must always win.
These are only some of the most significant provocations: NATO expansion, deposing a democratically elected government, funneling weapons into a civil war on Russia's border. I haven't even mentioned the torn-up nuclear treaties and the years of domestic anti-Russian propaganda pushed onto the American people through an unholy alliance between U.S. intelligence agencies and the corporate press.
Dehumanization as a tactic for politics is from war. Dehumanization is it's a tactic. It's being used right now.
Watching the video, and on the Senate floor, there's a cop who's armed, and a guy bursts in, the QAnon shaman, dressed like a Viking, and he basically talks to him. I'm watching. Shoot him. Shoot him. Like, if you burst into the United States, if he was dressed like Bin Laden, would you have shot him?
The Russians get their soldiers to rape children by dehumanizing them. Dehumanization as a practice is a tactic of war. It's being deployed in our politics, and people like you and I sometimes lose the plot and admire its effectiveness, not its substance, but even the analysis of these tactics loses sight of what this speech brings us back to, which is that dehumanization has a cost right now, as it's being deployed. There are children, and Chasten Buttigieg made this point when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was introduced. Kids will die. How do we bring it back to the substance of the harm that is done by any strategy in war and politics of dehumanizing people?
Do you all remember that report that Vladimir Putin was putting bounties on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan? That story was as false as the reports of Iraqi soldiers ripping Kuwaiti babies from incubators in the lead up to Desert Storm. Pure war propaganda. It was completely debunked. This disinformation was planted in the media by, quote, anonymous intelligence officials in the lead up to a major U.S. election.
The threats to our elections in, 2.5 weeks are so pervasive and they're so dire and they include violence. I mean, do you think it's time to ask for friends and allies to come over and help us monitor our elections? We used to do that in other burgeoning and threatened democracies.
But if you ever read a retraction, you were lucky to find it on page 36 after months of front page coverage. That's how war propaganda works with the war machine. Lie, rinse, repeat, and never apologize. And let me preempt the accusations that I know will be coming likely outside this chamber, because I would never suggest that anyone in this chamber would make such accusations. But let me preempt it by stating clearly that Vladimir Putin, like so many governmental leaders across the world, is a tyrant. As a lover of liberty, he could be strung up like Saddam Hussein, and I wouldn't shed a tear. There's plenty of blood on his hands, and I'm sure that the day he meets his maker, there will be a lot to account for. So it is not for the sake of any despot that I oppose this resolution, but for love of our country and the wisdom of early leaders like George Washington and John Quincy Adams, who warned our country against entangling alliances, being drawn into European power struggles, and going abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And for the love of all the people caught up in this war, for the conscripted and enslaved men of Ukraine and Russia pitted against each other to the death for the benefit of oligarchs, for the many dead and displaced civilians, for those starving across the world from the consequences of a war in the Ukrainian breadbasket, for those in Europe, America, and here in Maine, freezing this winter due to natural gas shortages, and for everyone alive today and generations yet unborn who face the very real threat of nuclear annihilation, we must demand immediate diplomacy to end this war. Yet we see no diplomacy from Washington. In the rattling of their sabers for war with Russia, the Uniparty claims it is love of democracy and hatred of tyrants that drives them. So where are these affections as they partner with Saudi princes to genocide the people of Yemen? What makes the Yemeni people less worthy of our concern? Is their skin the wrong color? Are their lives of less value because they live in the wrong part of the world? Or is Washington simply so addicted to Saudi oil and the petrodollar that props up our paper currency that the deaths of 250,000 people is worth the cost? Madam President, it seems George Orwell predicted the state we find ourselves in. If you listen to the talking heads on the television screens, it would seem we've always been at war with Eurasia. But if you go searching down the memory hole for scraps of what was and possibilities of what could have been, you will find stories about the days when George W. Bush and Vladimir Putin toured Texas high schools together after the Russian president's call of support following the 9/11 Twin Tower attacks. You will find stories about Secretary of State Hillary Clinton hitting a reset button on U.S.-Russian relations for a new era of peace. So when did all this change? It is certainly not just that Vladimir Putin is a tyrant. As I've established, our leaders in Washington are fond of many tyrants around the world. The public pivot seems to have taken place when Russia stood opposed to the invasions of Iraq, Libya, and Syria, all grossly unconstitutional wars by our own American standards and waged for no clear American purpose beyond the profits of that institution Eisenhower warned us of. When Russia blocked the dreams of regime change in Syria, this appears to have been the last straw, and we've seen nothing but provocation and heard only drumbeats for war ever since. Madam President, the stakes on this matter are higher than any war in my admittedly short life of 34 years. Unlike Iraq, the nuclear weapons are not the imagined fantasies of war profiteers. The arsenals are real. Continued escalation is toying with nuclear fire, which could set the world ablaze. Today, we are fortunate to be alive to be able to look back at Iraq and admit mistakes were made. But 20 years from now, will we be so able under the clouds of nuclear winter? Even should the nukes stay put, and God help us, I hope so, nothing else good can be had from this war. The Ukrainian people die while peace talks should be taking place. America's strategic position in the world is weakened as China and Russia have formed an alliance against us. Our fair-weather friends in Saudi Arabia entertain breaking the petrodollar, threatening the U.S. dollar's status as the global reserve currency and unleashing hyperinflation on our country. Rising economic powers, including India, refuse to fall in line with U.S. sanctions, as it turns out that after decades of invading foreign countries in the Middle East, few nations outside Europe recognize America's moral authority anymore on the question of invading foreign countries. And Madam President, if this resolution was truly in the interest of peace, I will tell you what it would say. It would not call for continued conditionless spending and racking up trillions of dollars more in debt on the American people in order to draw out a war that endangers the whole world. This resolution would demand that Secretary of State Antony Blinken go to Geneva and sit down for peace talks with both Russian and Ukrainian leaders to resolve this border dispute, broker a peace, end the war, end the famine, end the energy crisis, and take the very real threat of nuclear annihilation off the table. That is what this body should be calling for. Peace, not war. I invite every member of this body to join me in voting for peace by rejecting this resolution. Thank you very much for your time and your consideration.